The air in the ballroom was thick, smelling of expensive perfume and the kind of ambition that hums. I stood near a service entrance, the fabric of my simple dress a constant reminder that I didn't belong. Every other person seemed to glide, their movements smooth and practiced, their laughter echoing with an easy confidence I'd never known. All eyes were on the small stage where my brother Alex, the family's golden boy, was bathed in a spotlight, accepting an award for something to do with political strategy. He flashed his signature charismatic smile, the one that had always gotten him out of trouble and into rooms just like this one. In the front row, my parents were practically glowing. My mother, Carol, a woman who valued appearances above all else, dabbed at her eyes with a silk handkerchief. Beside her, my father, Richard, a man who lived for these moments of vicarious success, looked more proud than I'd ever seen him. Certainly more than the day I'd graduated from one of the military's most grueling training programs. Their rapt attention on him was a familiar sight, a tally on an internal ledger I'd been keeping for 20 years. For Alex, a plaque and a handshake got him this look of adoration. For me, saving a life got me a polite, confused nod and a quick change of subject. Then, a senator my father had idolized for decades turned to my mother and gestured vaguely in my direction. "Is that your daughter too, Carol?" he asked, his voice booming. I saw my mother's smile tighten for just a fraction of a second, a barely perceptible crack in her perfect facade. "Oh, that's Sarah. Yes," she said, her voice trailing off as if she was struggling to place me in her own life. "She's a medic. In the Air Force?" The hesitation hung in the air between us, a chasm of unspoken disappointment that felt wider than the entire room. As if on cue, my brother's best friend, standing beside the senator, leaned in and added the final crushing weight. He whispered, just loud enough for me to hear over the polite applause, "She's just a medic. Alex is the one with the real high-stakes job here in D.C." The words didn't spark anger or even sadness. They landed with a dull, heavy thud in the pit of my stomach. It was the sound of a truth I had always known, finally spoken aloud in a room full of people who would never understand, or even care to try. It was the quiet confirmation of my own invisibility, and the worst part? I wasn't even surprised. It was just the loudest echo of a story I had been living my whole life. That whisper at the gala wasn't a new wound. It was the salt poured into a very old one, a cut I'd carried since childhood. To understand the silence that fell over me in that ballroom, you have to understand the noise that always surrounded my brother Alex. He wasn't just the golden child, he was the sun, and the rest of us were just planets caught in his orbit, expected to circle him quietly and reflect his light. My parents, my mother Carol and my father Richard, weren't just bystanders. They were the architects of this little solar system. The ones who taught me my place was in the shadows. I remember the day he got his acceptance letter to Georgetown for his master's program like it was a national holiday. My mother wept with a joy so pure and potent, it felt like it could power the whole house. That weekend, they threw a massive party. Not for a birthday, not for an anniversary, but for an acceptance letter. The yard was filled with my father's colleagues from his mid-level government job and my mother's friends from the club, all the people they needed to see just how successful their son, and by extension they, had become. I spent most of the day refilling chip bowls, a ghost at my own family's celebration. The centerpiece of the event wasn't the cake or the champagne my dad bought. It was the brand new, deep blue sedan sitting in our driveway with a ridiculously large red bow on the hood. I watched as my father, his voice thick with emotion, handed the keys to Alex. "For your important future," he'd said. And in that moment, I didn't just see a car. I saw the braces my parents said we couldn't afford for me. I saw the school trips I'd missed because money was tight. I saw every single excuse and every maybe next year consolidated into 4 wheels and a full tank of gas, a tangible monument to their priorities. A year later, I had my own announcement. There was no party, just the 3 of them at the kitchen table, looking impatient. I told them I'd done it. I had passed the indoctrination course for Air Force pararescue. I tried to explain what that meant. The grueling physical and mental tests, the fact that more than 80% of candidates wash out. I told them the PJ motto, These things we do, that others may live, feeling a swell of pride in my chest that I was now part of that tradition. I was going to save lives. The pride evaporated in the dead air of their silence. My mother, Carol, was the first to speak, her brow furrowed in a look of deep maternal concern that felt more like disapproval. A medic? But honey, that's so dangerous. And dirty. Why couldn't you have been an officer, or just a regular nurse in a nice, clean hospital? She didn't hear elite soldier or special operator. She just heard medic, and her mind immediately went to blood and dirt, things that couldn't be bragged about at a luncheon. My father said even less. He just stared into his coffee cup, his disappointment a suffocating blanket. He wanted a son with a corner office, and now he had a daughter who voluntarily jumped out of helicopters into war zones. My strength wasn't an asset to him, it was a liability, a deviation from the comfortable, predictable life he envisioned. This was how the family's great, unspoken myth was born. It was the false narrative they constructed to make sense of their own blatant favoritism. Alex, they would tell people, was the brilliant one. He was the strategist, the one with a mind for policy, a man shaping the country from the halls of power. His work was clean, abstract, and deeply impressive at cocktail parties. It was a success story they could easily tell, one that made them look good. It made them feel important. And me? Oh, Sarah was the simple one. That's how they framed it. She was always such a tomboy, my mother would say with a sigh. She chose a more hands-on path. Something noble, of course, but small. They had to shrink my life's calling down to a manageable size. They took my reality, a world of high-stakes rescue missions, advanced medical protocols under fire, and life-or-death decisions, and turned it into a hobby. They made me the simple medic so Alex could remain the brilliant mind. It wasn't a lie they told to hurt me. It was a lie they told to comfort themselves. Lying there in my bunk after a mission a few months ago, covered in grime and exhaustion but filled with a quiet sense of purpose, I finally accepted it. They would never see me, not really. Because to truly see me would be to admit their entire world, built around their golden sun, was a fragile illusion. So I decided I was done trying to be seen. Standing there in the back of the ballroom, the echo of that whisper, "She's just a medic," should have hurt. It should have been the final twist of a knife I'd felt my entire life. But something strange happened in that moment. The familiar sting of being invisible, of being minimized, simply vanished. It was replaced by a profound and unnerving calm, a cold clarity that settled over me like a sheet of ice. The years of quiet frustration and desperate hope for a crumb of recognition finally coalesced into a single, simple thought. They would never change, so I had to. I made a decision, right there between the service door and a potted fern. I was going to stop. I was going to stop correcting them, stop defending my choices, stop trying to explain the unexplainable parts of my life. The sheer exhaustion of trying to earn their approval, a currency they only ever printed for my brother, finally lifted. It was like setting down a weight I didn't even realize I'd been carrying for 2 decades. I would no longer fight for my place in their narrative. I was done. With my back still to the room, I subtly pulled out my phone. It wasn't to text a friend for support or to vent my anger. My thumb bypassed all the usual apps and opened a secure, encrypted messenger. There was one unread message from a few hours earlier, sent from my commanding officer. My heart didn't race, it beat with a slow, steady rhythm. The message was simple, direct, and held the power to shatter the fragile reality of this entire evening. TSGT Miller, POTUS is confirmed for the gala. He is attending for Operation Nightingale debrief. Your presence is requested on site. Stand by. Operation Nightingale. The name itself felt like it belonged to another universe, one of dust, adrenaline, and impossible choices made in the dark. It was the classified code name for the high-risk rescue mission I'd led just weeks ago, pulling 3 diplomats from the rubble of a collapsed embassy. My receipts weren't screenshots or angry diary entries. My receipt was an operation my family knew nothing about, and my witness, well, he was the President of the United States. My plan, therefore, was the easiest one I'd ever had to formulate. I just had to wait. I had the truth. I had the venue. And I had the ultimate, undeniable witness on his way. All I had to do was stand still and wait for their world to burn. My brother Alex was finishing his speech, his voice dripping with the false modesty he had perfected over a lifetime. He thanked his mentors, the foundation that gave him the award, and of course his wonderfully supportive family, gesturing vaguely toward our parents. The crowd offered polite applause, and I just watched, feeling a strange sense of detachment, as if I were observing the final act of a play I already knew by heart. Alex stood there, soaking in the validation, his smile wide and triumphant. He genuinely believed this was the greatest moment of his life, completely unaware that his life was about to be irrevocably defined by the next 5 minutes. Then, the atmosphere in the room shifted. It wasn't a loud noise, but a sudden, palpable change in energy, like a drop in barometric pressure before a storm. Men in dark, impeccably tailored suits with coiled wires in their ears appeared at the entrances. They didn't say a word, but their presence alone was enough to drain the chatter from the room. A hush fell over the crowd, and through the main doors, the President of the United States walked in. My mother gasped, her hand flying to my father's arm. Their faces lit up with a kind of vicarious ecstasy I knew all too well. This was it. The ultimate confirmation of their son's importance. Alex, still near the stage, straightened his tie and puffed out his chest, a prince ready to be acknowledged by the king. The president moved with a quiet purpose, his Secret Service detail parting the sea of gawking guests. His eyes swept the room, calm and searching. He nodded politely at a few familiar faces, but he was clearly looking for someone specific. His gaze passed over the senators, the donors, and then it happened. The moment that is forever burned into my memory. His eyes slid directly over my brother's eager, smiling face without a single flicker of recognition. For a split second, Alex was just another face in the crowd, and in that non-moment, his entire universe of self-importance wobbled on its axis. I saw his smile falter, the first tiny crack in the golden facade. Then the president's eyes found me. Hidden in the back, leaning against the wall, I saw his expression change. The polite public mask fell away, replaced by a genuine, warm smile, and he started walking, not toward the stage, not toward my parents, but directly toward me. The crowd of influential people instinctively shuffled aside, their confused murmurs fading into a stunned silence. Every eye in the room followed him as he closed the distance, stopping right in front of me. He extended a hand, and his voice was clear and resonant, cutting through the dead air of the ballroom. "TSGT Miller," he said, "I'm so glad you could make it. I've been waiting to meet the woman who led Operation Nightingale." The silence that followed was absolute. It was so profound I could hear the hum of the air conditioning. My brother's face didn't just fall, it shattered. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving behind a pasty, slack-jawed mask of disbelief. My mother's hand was clamped over her mouth, her eyes wide with a horror that was slowly being eclipsed by utter confusion. A 4-star Air Force general who had entered with the president's entourage stepped forward into the void. He was a man who commanded authority just by breathing. "For those of you who don't know," the general announced, his voice booming into the silence, "the president is here tonight to personally recognize a member of our special operations community. Technical Sergeant Miller recently led her pararescue team on a high-risk mission to save the lives of 3 American diplomats after an embassy collapse in hostile territory." He then turned his head slightly and looked directly at the senator my mother had been schmoozing earlier. "In fact, Senator," the general continued, his tone sharp as steel, "it was your chief of staff she pulled from the rubble with her own 2 hands. And in the ringing silence, I didn't feel anger or victory. I just felt quiet. For the first time, I was the one who got to walk away." The president gave my shoulder a firm, respectful squeeze and then moved on, his entourage sweeping him toward the exit. The spell over the room was broken, and the low murmur of confused gossip began to swell. In that moment, the bubble of quiet around me burst, and my family descended. They scrambled toward me, their faces a chaotic mess of shock, shame, and a desperate, clawing need to reassert their place in the story. My father was first, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. "Sarah?" "We didn't know," he stammered, as if that explained 20 years of dismissiveness. My mother, Carol, clutched my arm, her manicured nails digging into my skin. "A hero. They said you're a hero? Why didn't you ever tell us?" Her question wasn't born of a desire to understand me, but of a frantic need to understand her own social miscalculation. It was never about my life. It was about how my life reflected on her. Then came Alex, his face pale and his eyes burning with a furious, wounded pride. He didn't ask a question. He made an accusation. "You planned this," he hissed, his voice low and trembling. "You did this to make me look bad." I looked at the three of them, my creators, my narrators, my judges. For the first time, I saw them not through a haze of childhood longing, but with the same clear, objective assessment I'd use on a rescue mission. And I felt nothing. No anger, no need to explain, no desire for a last-minute apology. The ledger was closed. I gave them no answer, just a calm, level look that held none of the recognition they so desperately craved. Then I turned my back on them and walked toward the general, who was waiting to introduce me to the very diplomats whose lives I had saved. I left my family standing alone in the center of their shattered world. The next morning, I was 1,000 miles away from the perfume and politics of that ballroom. I was back on base, the familiar comforting smell of jet fuel and cheap coffee in the air. The crisp morning air cut through the lingering strangeness of the night before. I was in my element, surrounded by my team, my real family. These were the men and women who knew my capabilities, who trusted me with their lives, and who didn't need a presidential announcement to see my worth. We shared a joke over a dented table in the briefing room, and the laughter was real, easy, and free from the weight of expectation. This was my world. This was where I belonged. The peace I felt was so profound, so absolute. It was like breathing clean air after a lifetime in a smoke-filled room. Later, I glanced at my phone. It was a minefield of their panic. There were 3 missed calls from my father. I saw the transcript of his voicemail, his voice a strange, strained mix of feigned pride and utter confusion. There were 15 texts from my mother, a frantic stream of consciousness that devolved from, "We need to talk," to, "What am I supposed to tell the Martins?" Her terror wasn't for my safety, past or present, but for her own social standing. And then there was the text from Alex. One single predictable line, "I can't believe you embarrass me like that." I read his words, and I didn't feel a sting of anger or a pang of guilt. I just felt tired, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion from a lifetime of dealing with his fragile ego. So I did the one thing I should have done years ago. I opened his contact. I pressed the button. Block. Then I went to my mother's contact. Block. And finally, my father's. Block. With each tap, another chain broke. It wasn't a dramatic, angry act. It was quiet. It was peaceful. It was freedom. In the weeks that followed, my life didn't change, but my world did. The missions were still dangerous, the hours were still long, but the ghost was gone. The constant, low-level hum of needing their approval, of hoping they might finally see me, had vanished. The space it left behind was filled with a quiet confidence. I heard through a cousin, months later, that Alex's meteoric rise in D.C. had mysteriously stalled. The story of the gala had become a quiet piece of political lore, the tale of the self-important aide who was so out of touch he didn't even know his own sister was a decorated war hero. His currency had always been perception, and that perception was now permanently tainted. He was no longer seen as a rising star, but as a hollow suit. They never understood, not really. But their understanding was no longer a prerequisite for my peace. I learned that your value isn't determined by the people who refuse to see you. It's forged in the actions you take when no one is watching. If you've ever had to define your own worth, drop a comment below. Your story matters.